Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Got a story tonight about a father who built everything he had with his own two hands, and nearly lost all of it by forgetting that his daughter had two hands of her own. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let me tell you about Warren Calloway, his daughter, Clara, and a young Lakota man named Eli Spotted Horse, who came looking for work on a cold April morning and found something nobody on that ranch was expecting. On the last morning Eli Spotted Horse worked the Calloway ranch, Warren Calloway walked out to the fence and said, "You're done here. Collect your pay and ride." Eli didn't argue. He just looked past the rancher to where Clara was standing on the porch 20 yards behind her father, watching, not moving, her hands still at her sides. And then Clara Calloway did something her father had never seen her do in 22 years. She walked past him, straight past him, without a word, without a look, and she stood next to Eli. Before I tell you what happened after that, I need to tell you how it all began, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. And the beginning starts on a cold April morning, 3 months before that fence, when a young man rode up to the Calloway gate with nothing but a good horse, a quiet manner, and hands that knew what they were doing. Welcome to Western Sleep's story, where the Old West carries you to sleep every week. I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Now, let's go back to that April morning. The Calloway Ranch sat on 400 acres of good grassland in the valley south of Bitter Creek, and Warren Calloway had built every inch of it the hard way. He had arrived in the territory 26 years earlier with $60, a wagon, and a wife named Helen, who had more backbone than most men he had ever met. They had broken ground together, built the first structure, a one-room cabin that leaked in 3 places, together, and had raised a daughter in that cabin while slowly, methodically expanding the ranch into something that could feed a family and then some. Helen had died 8 years ago, a fever, fast and final, the kind that gave no warning and allowed no negotiation. Warren had buried her on the east slope of the property, under a cottonwood tree she had always said she liked the look of. After that, it was just Warren and Clara. Clara was 14 when her mother died, and she had grown into the kind of young woman that Helen would have recognized immediately. Practical, observant, with a stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for shyness. She was not shy. She simply did not speak unless she had something worth saying, which Warren had always respected without quite knowing how to say so. By the time Clara was 22, she ran the household end of the ranch with a quiet competence that Warren depended on completely, though he rarely mentioned it. She kept the accounts. She managed the supply orders. She knew the names of every horse on the property and their individual temperaments. She could also ride better than any of the 3 hands Warren employed, which she demonstrated approximately once a month when one of those hands needed reminding of something and she chose to demonstrate it rather than say it. Warren employed 3 permanent hands. He had been looking for a 4th since February, when a young man named Pete Greer had left to follow his brother to California. The work had piled up in Pete's absence. There was fencing to mend on the north pasture, and the spring foaling season was coming, and Warren had been putting in 16-hour days since February trying to cover what Pete's absence had left uncovered. He was tired, he was short of patience, and he was not on the April morning that Eli Spotted Horse rode up to the gate in any particular mood to be particular. Eli was 23 years old. He was Lakota on his mother's side, and his father had been a Montana trapper who had spent 3 winters in the Northern Territories before settling down into a life that suited nobody involved, including himself. Eli had his mother's dark eyes and his father's height, and he had grown up between 2 worlds in the particular way that meant he was fully at home in neither and competent in both. He had been working ranches since he was 16. He was good at it, not in the showy way of some hands who wanted you to notice how good they were, but in the quiet, consistent way of someone who understood animals and land and the particular rhythms of outdoor work. He didn't waste motion. He didn't need to be told things twice. He arrived at the Calloway gate on a clean-limbed sorrel horse and asked, without preamble, if there was work available. Warren looked at him for a moment. He looked at the horse. The horse was in excellent condition, well-fed, well-groomed, moving without tension. Warren had a theory developed over 26 years of working with horses that the condition of a man's horse told you most of what you needed to know about the man. A man who took poor care of his horse took poor care of everything. A man who took good care of his horse was generally worth talking to. He hired Eli the same morning. The terms were the same as for any hand. Room in the bunkhouse, meals, $12 a month. Eli accepted without bargaining, which Warren also noted. Men who bargained hard over wages usually bargained hard over everything else, too, including the quality of their work. The other 3 hands, a taciturn older man named Duff, a young cowboy from Kansas named Reese, and a weather-beaten man everyone called Kolb, who had been on the property so long he seemed like a geological feature, accepted Eli's arrival with varying degrees of acknowledgement. Duff said nothing. Reese said hello. Cobb looked at the sorrel horse and said it was a fine-looking animal. This was, in the economy of the Calloway bunkhouse, a warm welcome. Clara saw the new hand from the kitchen window on his first morning. She watched him work for about 10 minutes, the way he moved around the horses in the south corral, the particular care he took with the latch on the gate, the way he spoke quietly to a young filly who had been nervous since February. And she went back to her accounts. She noted in the private ledger of her own observations that he knew what he was doing. That was the beginning. The first 6 weeks of Eli's time on the Calloway ranch passed without incident, which, on a working ranch, meant they passed well. He mended the north pasture fence, which required 4 days of steady work in conditions that alternated between cold and colder. He helped Duff and Reese with the spring foaling, during which he proved to be exceptionally calm under pressure. 2 of the births were complicated, and Eli handled both with a quiet competence that Duff, who did not praise easily, acknowledged with a single nod that meant more than a speech from anyone else. He was good with the difficult horses. There was a 3-year-old stallion on the property named Drum who had been purchased a previous fall and who had, in 6 months, managed to resist every effort to work him. Warren had been considering selling him. Eli asked on his 3rd week if he could spend time with Drum. Warren said he could try. What followed was not dramatic. There was no single moment of breakthrough, no particular day when Drum went from unworkable to willing. What there was, over 4 weeks of patient, daily, unhurried work, was a gradual change in the horse's relationship to human presence. Drum began to tolerate, then to accept, then slowly to meet Eli halfway. Warren watched this process with the attentiveness of a man who appreciated craftsmanship in any form. He did not say much about it, but he extended Eli's position from temporary to permanent without discussion, and Eli accepted this the same way he had accepted the original terms, quietly, without bargaining, as if it were simply the next reasonable thing. Clara noticed all of this. She noticed it the way she noticed most things on the ranch, through the window, during her accounts, in passing. She was not watching Eli specifically. She was watching everything, because that was how she had always operated. Wide attention, recording the state of things, noting changes. What she noted, over 6 weeks, was that the new hand worked with his whole attention, never complained about conditions or tasks, and had a particular quality of patience with difficult animals that she recognized because she had it herself and because she had observed that most people did not. The first real conversation happened in the 5th week. She was in the barn checking on one of the foaling mares who had been slow to recover her appetite. Eli came in to get a piece of tack and found her there, crouched beside the mare's stall with a hand on the animal's nose. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. He said, "She's been eating a little more the last 2 days." She said, "I know. I've been watching." He said, "The fennel helped. Old remedy. My mother used it." She looked at the mare for a moment, then back at him. "I didn't know about the fennel," she said. "I should have. Thank you." He got the tack. He left. That was the whole of it. 3 exchanges each. One brief and specific and about the horse. Clara went back to the house and wrote the fennel remedy in her household notes under the heading Remedies Equine. She did not think about the conversation more than necessary, but she remembered it clearly, in the way you remember things that are exactly what they needed to be and nothing more. The conversations that followed were all like that at first. Short, practical, focused on the work, a question about one of the younger horses, a note about the condition of the south pasture, an observation about weather coming in from the north. Each one brief, each one accurate, each one leaving her with the particular satisfaction of having talked to someone who was paying attention. There was a conversation in the 3rd week about the creek that ran along the eastern property line. Clara had noticed the water level was lower than the previous spring and mentioned it without particularly expecting a response. Eli said he had noticed the same thing, and that there was a beaver dam 2 miles upstream he had seen on his first ride of the property boundary, which he had done quietly and without being asked, because that was the kind of man he was. Clara had noted the low water but not found the cause. She told him this directly. He said the dam would need clearing before the dry season extended further, and that he would handle it if Warren gave approval. Clara told her father. Warren said to handle it. Eli handled it. The water came up within a week. This was the template for all of it. Not the romantic version people told later, not a story of 2 people who looked at each other across a fence and felt something immediate and certain. It was quieter than that, and more earned. It was the slow accumulation of being seen accurately, someone noticing what you notice, caring about what you care about, doing the work without waiting to be asked. Clara had lived on this land for 22 years. She knew its rhythms and its requirements in a way that no one in Bitter Creek had ever shown much interest in. The men who came through were interested in cattle numbers and acreage and the price of beef in fall. Nobody had ever asked her about the creek level or the condition of the south pasture grass or what she thought about the timing of the second cutting. Eli asked. Not all at once, not in a way that felt like questioning. In the way of someone working the same land who understood she knew things worth knowing. She began to look forward to those conversations without deciding to. There was a disagreement in the 5th week about a young 2-year-old mare who had been difficult to halter since birth. Clara thought the problem was in the approach, that someone had been too quick early on and created an association between the halter and discomfort. Eli thought the problem was environmental, that the mare needed a quieter space and less pressure before any equipment was introduced at all. They debated this for 3 evenings at the fence, both of them precise, both drawing on observations made independently. In the end, they tried Eli's approach first because his reasoning was more specific. It took 10 days, and it worked. Clara told him plainly his reasoning had been right. He told her that her observation about the early handling had also been right. It was why the environmental approach needed as much time as it did. It was the most comfortable exchange Clara had experienced since her mother died. She did not say this to anyone. She filed it in the private ledger under a heading she did not write down. By the end of the 6th week, they had established what might be called, in the careful language of people who do not name things prematurely, a working understanding. They noticed the same things. They arrived at the same conclusions, generally, about what needed doing. They disagreed occasionally about timing, about method, and when they disagreed, both of them said so plainly and listened to the other's reasoning. It was the most comfortable exchange Clara had experienced since her mother died. She did not say this to anyone. She filed it carefully in a private ledger under a heading she did not write down. Warren Calloway was not an unobservant man. He had built a ranch from nothing through a combination of hard work, sound judgment, and the particular kind of attention to detail that separates a man who survives the frontier from one who thrives on it. He noticed the weather before it arrived. He noticed the condition of the grass before it became a problem. He noticed when an animal was off before anyone else said so. He noticed, in the 8th week of Eli's time on the property, that his daughter was lingering at the fence. It was not dramatic. Clara had always walked the property. She had done it since childhood, a habit her mother had started and she had continued. She walked the perimeter in the evenings, checking things, noting things, being present to the land in the way that people who genuinely belong to a piece of ground are present to it. But in the 8th week, Warren noticed that her evening walks had a new, consistent endpoint, the north fence, where Eli often worked late. He watched this for 3 evenings before he said anything, and what he said on the 4th evening was not to Clara. It was to Duff over coffee after supper in the barn, in the oblique way that men of Warren Calloway's generation and temperament addressed things that made them uncomfortable. He said, "The Spotted Horse boy. He conducting himself properly?" Duff, who had been on the property long enough to understand the grammar of Warren's oblique statements, said, "Far as I've seen, Warren drank his coffee." "Good," he said, and that was the end of his attention. He watched more carefully over the following 2 weeks. What he saw was, objectively, nothing alarming. His daughter and his hired hand spoke at the fence sometimes in the evenings. Their conversations appeared brief and practical. Eli was respectful in every observable way. He addressed Clara formally, kept a proper distance, and never sought her out during working hours in any way that could be interpreted as inappropriate. And yet, Warren Calloway had grown up in a time and a place where certain things were assumed. Not assumed cruelly or with any particular malice, simply assumed, the way the weather was assumed to come from the west and the sun was assumed to rise in the east. The territory had its own social geometry, and that geometry had certain clear lines, and one of those lines ran between a white rancher's daughter and a Lakota hired hand. He had never examined this assumption. He had never needed to. It had simply been part of the landscape of his understanding, as present and invisible as the horizon. It was becoming visible now. He thought about Helen. He thought about what Helen would have said, which was always a useful exercise because Helen had been significantly smarter than him about people. A fact he had acknowledged privately within the first year of their marriage and had been grateful for every day since. Helen would have said something precise and probably uncomfortable. She would have said it without cruelty, but without softening in the way she said everything. He could not reconstruct exactly what she would have said because he did not know exactly what she would have thought, and this uncertainty unsettled him more than a clear position would have. He did nothing for 2 more weeks. Then he saw them at the fence on a Tuesday morning, Clara laughing, that sound he had not heard in 2 years, and Eli on the other side, hat in his hands, saying something quiet, and he went inside and thought about it for the rest of the day. That night at supper he said to Clara, "The Spotted Horse boy is a good worker." Clara said, "Yes, he is. I want to make sure things stay professional out there." Clara looked at him across the table with the direct, clear look she had inherited entirely from her mother. "They are professional," she said. "We talk about the horses and the land. That's all." Warren said, "Good." He meant it as a conclusion. She accepted it as an answer to a question she had not asked. They finished supper in silence, but something had shifted in the house, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The fence on the north pasture became, over the following 3 weeks, the center of gravity of the Calloway ranch. Not because anything dramatic happened there. What happened there was the opposite of dramatic. 2 people talking, in the evenings after the work was done, about the things that mattered to them. Which horses were responding well. Which section of the east pasture looked thin. A book Clara had been reading. A natural history of the northern territories that she had ordered from the general store in town, and that Eli had recognized by title, because his father had owned a copy. The Lakota names for certain plants that grew along the creek, which Eli knew from his mother, and which corresponded to things Clara had been observing on the property without knowing what to call them. It was, in every external sense, an entirely ordinary exchange between 2 people who worked the same land and found they were interested in the same things. It was also, in every internal sense, something neither of them had been expecting. Eli had worked ranches since he was 16, and he had learned early and practically the social geometry of those places. He knew where the lines were. He was careful with them, not from fear exactly, but from the particular pragmatism of someone who has spent a lifetime navigating spaces where the rules were not written down but were very clearly enforced. He did not allow himself to think about Clara in any way that was not strictly practical. He was successful at this approximately 80% of the time. Clara had spent 8 years running the household and the ranch, with a father who was present but not particularly communicative, hands who were professional but not interested in the same things she was, and a social landscape in Bitter Creek that offered precisely nothing in the way of people who thought the way she thought. She had managed this with the same competence she brought to everything else, filling the space with books and work and the long evening walks. The fence conversations were something she had not been looking for and could not entirely account for. She knew what they were in the careful accounting of her own ledger. She knew they were not simply professional. She also knew they were conducted with complete propriety, which meant they existed in a space that had no clear name and no clear set of rules for what to do next. She did not discuss this with anyone. The thing that changed the geometry was not a conversation. It was an evening in the 7th week when the big sorrel, Eli's own horse, not a Calloway animal, got out of the paddock and wandered north, and Clara, who was returning from her evening walk, found the horse before Eli did and brought it back and was standing at the paddock gate holding the lead when Eli came running from the bunkhouse. He stopped when he saw her. She handed him the lead. Their hands touched for the length of time it takes to transfer a lead rope from one person to another. 3 seconds, perhaps. Eli's hand was warm from running. She was aware of the specific texture of the rope and the specific warmth of the brief contact and the specific quality of the pause that followed it. Eli said, "Thank you." She said, "He was in the north pasture. Gate latch is getting loose on that side." Eli said, "I'll fix it tomorrow." She said, "Good night." She walked back to the house. Neither of them referred to this again. But the nature of the evening fence conversations changed after it, in ways that were subtle and unmistakable and had no specific language attached to them. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were. Warren Calloway noticed the change, though he could not have said precisely what changed. He noticed it the way he noticed weather, not as a specific thing, but as a quality in the air, a shift in pressure that meant something was coming. He lay awake 3 nights in a row and thought about it, and on the 4th night he stopped thinking and started deciding. He was not a cruel man. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. What he was going to do was not cruel. It was practical. It was the kind of decision a man made to protect the things he had built, to maintain the kind of order that allowed a ranch and a family to continue functioning in the world as it was rather than the world as it might theoretically be. He told himself this on the 1st night, and the 2nd, and the 3rd. On the 3rd night, he lay awake long past when the house went quiet and thought about his father. His father had been a man of strong opinions, held with great certainty and rarely examined. He had been right about many things, practical things, farming things, things that could be tested against results. He had been wrong about other things, and the wrongness had cost him relationships that he had died, still not understanding he had lost. Warren had observed this and had promised himself, quietly and without fanfare, that he would not make the same mistake. He thought about that promise now. He thought about what Clara had said at supper. Not the words exactly, but the quality of her voice saying them. They are professional. We talk about the horses and the land, that's all. The voice of someone telling the truth who knows they are telling the truth and does not understand why the truth requires defending. He thought about Helen. Helen would have said, "You're building a wall, Warren, and you're telling yourself it's a fence." He thought about the difference between a wall and a fence. A fence let you see what was on the other side. It created a boundary without creating blindness. A wall was something different. A wall was a decision that what was on the other side did not need to be seen. He was not certain, lying there in the dark, which one he was building. He believed it was practical. He believed it was right. He was wrong about whether that made it right. But that was a thing he would understand later. The morning Warren Calloway walked out to the fence was a Thursday in late June, and the light was the particular pale gold of early morning before the heat arrived. He had been watching from the kitchen window for 20 minutes before he went out. He had seen Clara come from the house with 2 cups of coffee, something she had never done before, something so outside the established routine of the ranch that it registered immediately as significant, and walked to the north fence, where Eli was already working on the loose gate latch. She handed him a cup. He accepted it. They stood at the fence together, not close, not touching, drinking their coffee in the early light, and Warren watched from the window and felt the particular combination of things a man feels when he sees something he has been pretending not to see and can no longer pretend. He went out. He walked the length of the north pasture fence at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. Clara saw him coming first. He watched her face change, not to alarm, not to guilt, but to a careful composure that was its own kind of statement. Eli saw him a moment later and straightened, setting the coffee cup on the fence post. Warren stopped 10 feet from them. He looked at Eli. He said, "You're done here. Collect your pay and ride." The words came out the way he had rehearsed them. Flat, final, without ornament. He had been rehearsing them for 3 days. He had not rehearsed what came after. Eli did not argue. He did not look surprised exactly. He had the expression of someone receiving news they had, on some level, been expecting. He looked past Warren, and Warren turned slightly and saw Clara on the porch. She was standing very still. Her hands were at her sides. Warren turned back to Eli. "You'll be paid through the end of the week," he said. "I'll have Duff settle with you." Eli nodded once, and then Clara walked off that porch. Warren heard her footsteps behind him, the particular sound of his daughter's boots on the dry ground, a sound he had been hearing for 22 years, as familiar as the creek or the wind. He did not turn around immediately because part of him believed, or wanted to believe, that she was walking to the house, or to the barn, or anywhere other than where she was walking. She walked past him. She did not look at him. She did not say anything. She simply passed him at a distance of 2 feet, close enough that he could have reached out and stopped her, and she stood next to Eli Spotted Horse at the north fence of the Calloway ranch. The 3 of them stood in the morning light for a long moment. Warren said, "Clara," she said, "no." Quiet, certain, with no anger in it. The word of someone who has made a decision and is informing you of it, rather than asking your opinion. Warren said, "Go inside." She said, "I'm not going inside." He looked at his daughter across the distance between them, and he saw Helen looking back at him. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a living continuation, a woman with a clear mind and a clear understanding of what was right, who was telling him something he did not want to hear. He turned and walked back to the house. What followed that morning was a silence that had weight to it. Warren went into the house. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not make coffee. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the window that faced north, toward the fence where he could see, if he let himself look, two figures still standing, he did not look. He thought about what he had done. He thought about it with the same practicality he brought to every problem on the ranch. Taking it apart, examining the pieces, trying to understand what had gone wrong and what the correct adjustment was. The problem with this approach was that it assumed the original decision had been correct in its intent, only incorrect in its execution. Warren was beginning to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that this might not be the case. Clara came into the house an hour later. She did not slam the door. She did not announce herself. She came in, poured herself a cup of the coffee she had not drunk at the fence, and sat down across from her father at the kitchen table. Warren said, "He has to go, Clara." She said, "Tell me why." He said, "You know why." She said, "I want you to say it out loud." This was, Warren recognized, a trap, not a malicious one, but a trap of honesty, the kind his wife had set for him occasionally when she needed him to hear himself say something before he would understand what it meant. He said, "It's not appropriate." Clara said, "What isn't appropriate?" "The two of you. The friendship. It isn't, it doesn't." He stopped. He tried again. "People talk," she said. "Which people?" "Duff, Reese, Cobb." "People who—" "We haven't been to town together. We haven't been anywhere together. We talk at the fence about the horses and the land." "Clara, say it plainly, Papa." Her voice was still quiet, still without anger. That was the thing that undid him, the absence of anger. If she had been angry, he could have been angry back, and the whole thing could have resolved itself in heat and noise and been over. Instead, she was asking him to be precise, and precision was the thing he did not want to be. "You can say it to me. I can hear it." He looked at his hands. He said, finally, "He's Lakota, Clara." Then she said, "Your mother was Irish. When she came to this country, people said things about Irish people that I imagine weren't kind. Did that make her less of a person?" Warren said, "That's different." How? He did not have an answer that would survive being said aloud. He did not answer. She waited. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the house settling in the June heat, the particular creaks and adjustments of old wood that Clara had heard her whole life and had stopped noticing and was noticing again now. In the silence between herself and her father, she said, "Eli Spotted Horse is the best worker on this property. You know this. You knew it when you hired him, and you knew it when you told Duff to give him the permanent position. And you have known it every day since. He fixed the north fence. He cleared the beaver dam nobody else had found. He brought Drum around when you were ready to sell him. He does his work without complaint in conditions that would send other men to town." She kept her voice even. "He has never been anything but proper with me. I have never been anything but proper with him. We have talked at the fence about the horses and the land and a book we both happen to know. That is the entire sum of it. And if you are honest with yourself about what you are actually afraid of, not what has happened, but what you imagine might happen, then I want you to be honest about that too, because what you imagine and what is real are not the same thing." Warren's jaw was tight. She said more quietly, "And the sum of what is real, Papa, the honest sum of it, is that those conversations at the fence are the best I have felt since Mama died. Not because of anything improper, because for the first time in 8 years, someone on this property is interested in the same things I am interested in, and talks to me about them plainly, and listens when I talk back. She looked at him directly. You built this ranch for me to have? That is what you've told me my whole life. If that is true, then what you built it for is standing in your kitchen telling you something important, and I am asking you to hear it. Warren closed his eyes. She let him sit with it. She was good at that. Better than most, because she had learned it from her mother, who had understood that some things need to be said, and then left alone to do their work. After a long time, she said, I'm not asking you to approve of something you're not ready to approve of. I'm asking you not to send away a good man for a reason you can't say out loud without hearing how it sounds. She stood up. She rinsed her coffee cup. She set it on the rack. At the door, she said, He's at the bunkhouse. Duff hasn't paid him out yet. She went outside. Warren Calloway sat at that kitchen table for a long time. He sat with the silence of the house around him, the particular silence that Helen had warned him about once, early in their marriage, when he had made a decision without thinking it all the way through. She had said, The house gets quiet when you're wrong, Warren. Not as a punishment, just because wrong things don't make noise. He had not understood what she meant at the time. He understood it now. He thought about what Clara had said, not the emotional parts, the part about feeling better than she had in 8 years, which had landed somewhere complicated in his chest and was still sitting there. He thought about the factual parts, the north fence, the beaver dam, Drum, the permanent position he had given without discussion because it was obviously correct. He thought about the careful way that Eli Spotted Horse moved through the ranch, not pushing, not performing, not working for anyone's approval, just working, doing the thing that needed doing in the way it needed to be done, and then moving on to the next thing. Warren had spent 26 years trying to build a place that ran that way, on quality, on consistency, on people who did what they said and said what they meant. He had sent away a man who fit that description. He had sent him away for a reason he could not say aloud. He sat with that. He thought about a morning years ago when a man from the county land office had come to ask questions about the water rights on the eastern creek. The man had been efficient and polite, and had treated Warren's answers with a slight but consistent condescension. The particular condescension of someone who has decided before arriving who he is talking to and what that person is likely to know. Warren had answered every question correctly and completely, and the man had left, and Warren had stood on his porch and felt, for the first time in a while, what it felt like to be evaluated rather than seen. He had not liked the feeling. He thought about Eli Spotted Horse riding up to his gate on a cold April morning and asking for work. He thought about what he himself had looked at first, the horse. He had looked at the horse because the horse told him what he needed to know. He had not looked at the man's face, or his clothes, or the particular geography of his features and made a decision based on that. He had looked at the quality of the work, the quality of the care, and that had told him what he needed to know. He had done it right then. He had done it wrong this morning. He got up, he put on his hat, he walked out of the house, across the yard, and to the bunkhouse door. Eli was inside, sitting on his bunk, not packing, just sitting, hat on his knee, waiting with the patience of a man who had been waiting in uncertain situations his entire life and had developed a particular relationship with the wait itself. He looked up when Warren came in. Warren stood in the doorway. He said, "I owe you an apology." Eli said nothing. He waited. "The reason I gave you this morning was not a fair reason. You have done your work here with more care than I had a right to expect, and you have conducted yourself with complete propriety, and what I said to you this morning was not about your work or your conduct." He stopped. He made himself continue. "It was about something in me that I am not proud of, and I am sorry for it." Eli looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I appreciate that." Warren said, "I'd like you to stay on, if you're willing." A pause. "The terms as agreed," Warren added. "And I'll raise it $2. Eli was quiet for another moment. He was not making Warren wait out of cruelty. He was thinking the way he did everything carefully and without rushing. He said, "I'll stay." Warren nodded. He started to go. At the door, Eli said, "Mr. Calloway." Warren turned. "Your daughter is a good person. She thinks clearly and she works hard and she cares about this land the way it deserves to be cared about." He met Warren's eyes. "I wanted you to know that I see that I've always seen that, and that nothing I do here will be disrespectful of it." Warren held his gaze. He said, "I know." He walked back to the house. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the north fence. Clara was there, back to him, looking out over the pasture. The morning had moved on into something warmer, the pale gold of early light replaced by the full sun of a June day. He went inside and made coffee. He did not make any announcements. He did not gather everyone together and explain. He simply went about his afternoon in the way a man goes about an afternoon when he has done something difficult and correct and needs time to let it settle. At supper, he set 3 places at the table instead of 2. Clara looked at the 3rd place. She looked at her father. He said, "I asked Eli to join us." Then she set down the dish she was carrying and straightened and looked at him with the full force of her mother's eyes, and Warren Calloway understood, in that moment, that he had done the right thing, not because it had been easy, not because it had come naturally, but because it was true. She said, "I'll get another chair." What happened after that supper is not a dramatic story. There was no single event, no confrontation, no moment that the town of Bitter Creek pointed to afterward as the turning point. What happened was quieter than that and more durable. Eli Spotted Horse stayed on the Calloway ranch through the summer and into the fall. The work continued. Drum, the difficult stallion who had resisted every previous effort to work him, became, by July, one of the best performing horses on the property. Warren watched this transformation with the attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, and he understood that what Eli had done with Drum was not so different from what Clara had asked of him. Be patient. Be consistent. Don't let your assumptions decide the outcome before the work is done. The fence conversations continued. They were no longer the only conversations. There were suppers on certain evenings and occasional afternoons when the 3 of them walked the property together, checking fencing or assessing pasture condition, and the talk moved between practical and personal, in the way of people who have been honest with each other about something important and can therefore be honest about everything else. Warren learned things he had not known. He learned that Eli's mother had been a woman of considerable knowledge about plants and land, that she had taught her son to read the seasons in ways that complemented rather than duplicated the ranching knowledge Warren had accumulated over 26 years. He learned that Eli had been sending money to his mother's sister since he was 17, that he had plans for his own land someday, that he had been looking for a place where the work was honest and the people were fair. He began to see what Clara had seen. It took longer than it should have. He knew that. But the seeing when it came was real and thorough, in the way that Warren Calloway's understanding of things was always real and thorough once it finally arrived. He saw that Eli Spotted Horse was a man who had spent his life being evaluated before he was seen, who had learned, the way people in that position learn, to let his work speak with the patience of someone who understood that words were not always heard, but results could not be argued with, who had come to this ranch with no expectations beyond fair turns and honest work, and who had found, unexpectedly in the evenings at the north fence, someone who spoke the same language he spoke about the land and the animals and the particular quality of attention that good work required. He saw that his daughter had been waiting for 8 years for exactly that. Not for Eli specifically, for someone, for a person who met her where she actually was, rather than where they assumed she should be. He saw that he had been so occupied with protecting her from what the world might do to her, that he had not looked carefully at what the world was actually offering. He sat with this understanding. It was not comfortable. Important understandings generally are not. He did not become a different man overnight. He was not that kind of man. He changed slowly the way good land changes, through the accumulation of seasons rather than through any single dramatic event. But he changed, and the people who knew him best, Clara, and eventually Eli, and old Duff who noticed everything and said nothing, could see it in the small adjustments of his daily behavior, the way he started including Eli in the morning planning discussions, the way he asked, occasionally, what Eli had observed about a particular section of the pasture or a particular horse's condition, the way he listened to the answer. It took longer than it should have. He knew that. In the fall, Clara asked her father something she had been thinking about for several weeks. She asked if there was a piece of land on the east side of the property, the section along the creek, the 40 acres that had always been too wet for conventional grazing, that might be used for a different purpose. She had been reading about creek bottom land and what could be done with it. She had been talking with Eli about it. There were possibilities if someone were willing to do the work. Warren thought about it. He said he would look at the land with her. They walked it on a Saturday morning. All three of them, Warren, Clara, and Eli, moving through the creek bottom section as the fall light came down through the cottonwoods and the water ran clear and steady beside them. Eli pointed out where the soil was deep and where it was thin. Clara pointed out where the drainage ran. Warren looked at the land he had owned for 26 years with the particular attention he had spent those years developing, and he saw what they were describing. He said, "It could work." Clara said, "It will take 2 seasons to know for certain." Eli said, "Good work usually does." Warren looked at the creek. He thought about Helen, who had always liked the cottonwoods. He said, "Then we'd better start." The three of them walked back to the house in the fall light, and the Calloway ranch stretched out around them. 400 acres of good grassland, one difficult stallion now working well, one section of creek bottom waiting for what it might become. And Warren Calloway understood something he should have understood sooner. He had built this place with his hands. But what kept it alive was the people who cared about it. and the people who cared about it did not have to look the way he had assumed they would look, or come from the places he had assumed they would come from. They just had to care. The winter that year was mild. The work continued. On the last day of November, Eli rode into Bitter Creek on his sorrel horse and came back with a small package from the general store that he left on the kitchen step, wrapped in brown paper with no note attached. Clara opened it the next morning. It was a book, a volume of Lakota stories translated into English, published by a press in St. Louis. She recognized two of the plant names from their fence conversations in the margin notes, marked in a careful hand. She held it for a moment. She had owned a great many books. She had grown up with books the way some children grow up with toys. They were her company, her education, her occupation in the hours when the work was done. She knew the particular weight of a book that had been chosen with attention, as opposed to the weight of a book purchased as a gesture or an obligation. The difference was something she had always been able to feel without being able to explain. This book had been chosen with attention. She could feel it in the heft of it, in the specific pages that were marked, in the fact that the margins contained the plant names, a quiet acknowledgement of their conversations, a bridge between two bodies of knowledge offered without ceremony or expectation. She sat at the kitchen table for a while. She thought about the morning at the fence and the walk back from it, and her father standing on the porch looking at the north pasture. She thought about the supper with the 3 places set, and the way her father had said, "Then we better start," on the creek bottom walk, and the particular quality of his voice saying it. Not the voice of a man performing an accommodation, but of a man who had arrived at something and was stating it plainly. She thought about the long shape of things, not just the 3 months since Eli had ridden up to the gate on a cold April morning, but the 8 years before it. The 8 years of running this ranch and keeping these accounts and walking these fences and talking to nobody about the things that mattered. The shape of that silence, which she had learned to carry the way you learn to carry any weight, by adjusting your posture and going about your days and not thinking too carefully about how heavy it was. The weight was lighter now. She did not know precisely what the future looked like. She was 22 years old on a working ranch in a valley where the social geometry had certain clear lines, and she was not so impractical as to believe that clear lines disappeared because she had decided not to observe them. There would be difficulties. There would be people in Bitter Creek with opinions. There would be seasons ahead that required navigation of the kind she could not entirely map in advance. She also knew that Eli Spotted Horse had plans for his own land someday, had said so plainly and early, and that those plans were real. She knew that what they had at the north fence was real. She knew that her father had set 3 places at the table and had meant it. She knew that the 40 acres along the creek had possibilities that 2 seasons of work would begin to reveal. These were the things she knew. They were enough to work with. She set the book on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the north pasture, where Eli was already at work in the cold morning air, moving with the same unhurried consistency he brought to every task on every day, his breath making small clouds in the November cold. She stood up. She put on her coat. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She walked out to the north fence, Warren watching from the kitchen window, because he still watched, and probably always would, which was simply the nature of a father who loved his daughter, saw her go. He saw her reach the fence. He saw Eli turn at her approach, and he watched the 2 of them stand together in the November light, the steam of their coffee rising slow in the cold air, the ranch spreading out around them on all sides, every acre of it built by hand, by work, by the stubborn accumulation of days. He turned from the window. He poured himself a third cup of coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table, in the particular quiet of a house that is at peace with itself, and he thought about Helen, who would have gotten here sooner and who would have told him gently, precisely, without reproach, that he had gotten here eventually, and that was what mattered. He thought she was probably right. He drank his coffee outside. The Calloway ranch ran on into the November morning. 400 acres and a 40-acre creek section, and a difficult stallion now working well, and two people at a fence talking about the things that mattered, in the quiet way of people who have learned that the things worth saying can be said plainly and at an ordinary pace, without hurry, without performance, in the full presence of the land they both belonged to. That was the Calloway Ranch in the fall of that year. It was not a grand story, not the kind that gets told quietly years later by the people who were part of it. The kind where the meaning was not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small, consistent, honest things. A fence mended, a creek cleared, a horse brought around, a chair pulled up to a table, a book left on a kitchen step with no note attached, a father who got it wrong and then, slowly and with difficulty, got it right. Those are the stories I find worth telling. Old-timers in Bitter Creek would say, if you asked, that the Calloway Ranch did well in the years that followed, that the creek bottom section turned into something useful after 2 hard seasons of work, just as Clara had said it would, that the horses wore and ran, particularly the line that came from Drum's foals, which carried something of his difficult brilliance tempered into something more workable, were sought after through the valley and beyond, that Warren Calloway mellowed in his later years in a way that the people who had known him young found surprising, and the people who knew the whole story found perfectly logical. They would say that his daughter was as good a rancher as any in the territory, that she had her mother's eye for land and her father's stubbornness about quality, and that she ran the east section along the creek with a knowledge that combined 2 different understandings of the same ground in a way that made the whole thing better than either understanding could have made it alone. And they would say, the ones who knew, the ones who had been there, that it had all started at a fence on the north pasture of a ranch in the valley south of Bitter Creek, on a cold April morning when a young man rode up to the gate on a clean-limbed sorrel horse and asked, without preamble, if there was work available. And the rancher had looked at the horse, and the horse had told him what he needed to know. The rest was time and work and the slow, difficult, beautiful accumulation of people doing right by each other when it would have been easier not to. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now. I don't know everything that came after that November morning at the north fence. Stories don't always give you the whole of it. They give you the part that matters, and they trust you to understand the rest. What I know is that the Calloway Ranch ran well for a long time after that fall, that the creek bottom land became something worth having after 2 seasons of work, just as Clara said it would, that the difficult stallion named Drum turned out to be one of the finest horses in that valley, which anyone who knew Eli Spotted Horse could have told you was no surprise. What I know is that Warren Calloway was not a bad man. He was a man who had an assumption he had never examined, and who was fortunate enough to have a daughter who asked him to examine it, and who, after sitting alone at a kitchen table with the particular silence that comes with being wrong, did the thing that was harder than staying wrong. That is a thing worth saying plainly. Doing right after doing wrong is still doing right. It counts. It matters. It is not as good as doing right the first time, but it is worth something real. And Warren Calloway spent the rest of his years finding out exactly what it was worth. You rest easy tonight, friend. And if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.